Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
That was very wet. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. I'm tired. Just probably like y'all. I just drove up from Vallejo just to be here to speak to y'all. And I have not finished my matcha, so I'm devoid of the caffeine that I need, but I'm grateful to be here. As Carmen said, my name is Brandon Green. I'm the Director of Policy Advocacy at the Western Center on Law and Poverty. I will refrain from saying all of those other titles that she just spoke about, but importantly, in almost all of my roles, I work in coalition and community with directly impacted folks, so it's a great honor to be here in unity with you all today. As those who know me understand, this work is deeply personal to me. Lawyer is my occupation, but not my central identity. As I was preparing for this, I laughed to myself, thinking about what my grandmother would think about me giving the keynote. As those close to me know, I can be a pretty quiet person, so much so that when I was little, my mother and grandmother took me to the doctor because they were worried that I could not talk. However, when they did, the doctor said that I could, I was just choosing not to. I was sort of spoiled, and my grandmother let me get away with pointing, so there really was not a need for words. Years later, as a kid who had a very clear perspective on what I believe justice to be, and oftentimes finding myself getting in trouble in school and sometimes at home for speaking out, my grandmother would bemoan this fact and tell me that I either had to be a lawyer or work for myself. So speaking here at length today will both surprise her and reinforce that she was right. So I've been lucky enough to avoid being incarcerated myself. I'm one of the few men in my family to do so. I'm the son of a formerly incarcerated person. Though I'm not close to my father, I still remember vividly when he was picked up from our home and taken away. When I was a public defender in Contra Costa County, my cousin, who's like my older brother, was arrested for drug trafficking. With his permission, I published a letter I wrote to the judge in his case in Silicon Valley Debug. In that letter, I noted how I had looked up to my cousin growing up, how he taught me how to dress and to talk to girls and other necessary tools and skills of my adolescence, and that I credited him as being an integral part of who I became. The case he was fighting was not a central identifying characteristic of him. I remember vividly walking out of court when I was in trial and receiving the call that he had been locked up, and the shame I felt for not being able to afford to bail him out, even though I was an attorney, ironically, a criminal defense attorney. A couple of years later, my little cousin, the nephew, the one I just mentioned, was locked up for murder at the age of 17. I could go on and detail all the many run-ins I had with law enforcement throughout my life and how it has always felt to me like prison was an inevitable and unavoidable place for me to land. But my point in sharing these anecdotes is that the work I've done as a lawyer has always been influenced by my experiences and those of the people closest to me. As a result, I always felt the deep commitment and responsibility for tackling these systems that have brought so much harm. This drive is not accidental. I'm both the product of an environment that resulted in various levels of systems involvement, as well as one deeply influenced by the work and struggle for civil rights. My grandparents landed in Las Vegas at a time in which black folks could serve in the Air Force as my grandfather did, but could not gamble downtown. As a result, black folks in West Las Vegas, the only real place that they could live in Las Vegas at the time, had to use their grit, creativity, and ingenuity to create their own spaces. And so they did, creating community and social hubs visited by the likes of Ella Fitzgerald and others. West Las Vegas was the birthplace of a local movement of mothers fighting for working wages and against the welfare mother trope. It's the place where my mother attended segregated schools until going to high school and having experienced the race riots that accompanied the integration. Going on to become the first in my family to do so and to go to college. It's also where I helped to organize and reopen wrongly closed streets as part of a lawsuit against the city of Las Vegas and the state of Nevada. The same way my forebears did as the expansion of freeways decimated black neighborhoods. This work would introduce me first to my first white attorney, the one representing the community group I was part of, and then to my first black attorney, both of whom would become instrumental in pushing me towards law school. I raise this history because it is apropos that all the things that made me who I am, the great civil rights fights, the organizing, the litigation strategies, the innovation, ingenuity, and labor of oppressed people, all of it is under siege. In the last week, former FBI Director James Comey and the Southern Poverty Law Center were both indicted. James Comey for posting a meme of seashells that said 8647. While this case will not likely result in a conviction, it is a clear signal of the willingness of the Trump administration to criminalize and stifle free speech. The sort of free speech that is necessary to fight oppression and to boldly speak truth to power. Similarly, the indictment of the Southern Poverty Law Center shows a willingness to politicize law enforcement, to go after organizations who engage in the work of unearthing and bringing to light wide networks of mostly white supremacist organizations. As we look to the midterm elections, the Supreme Court just released its decision in Callis versus Louisiana, all but making the Civil Rights Act null and void and likely greatly diluting the sort of minority political representation that made a number of the wins of the Civil Rights Movement possible. Harmeet Dillon, the Assistant Attorney General of the Civil Rights Division, widely known for her belief that the Civil Rights Movement went too far, has already signaled her intention to go after majority minority districts, stating that lines drawn to ensure representation are going to change in the coming years. All of this, of course, is happening after the Supreme Court's ruling in Students for Fair Admission v. Harvard, the case in which the ruling should have been limited to the higher admissions, but has since been expanded as a catch-all to attack all things Black, DEI, or racial justice themed. Just yesterday, 47 tweeted his intention to target museums in the same way that his administration has targeted universities, under the theory that teaching factually accurate history is simply wokeness gone awry. Edward Blum, the architect of many lawsuits since his victory in the Students for Fair Admission case, and others who share his view have since targeted the American Bar Association for scholarships that seem to enhance diversity in the legal profession, which is currently 86% white. The director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Latino and the director of the Institute of Museum and Library Services, or an internship program that strives to increase Latino representation in key museum roles. The Black Infant Health Program in Pasadena for denying a white woman entry, despite the fact that 30 years after the creation of the program, Black infants continue to have the highest rates of mortality, low birth weight, and prematurity of any group in the country. The Small Business Administration's regulation that establishes a rebuttable presumption of social disadvantage for members of designated racial and ethnic groups. And similarly, recently the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission recently sued Coca-Cola over a networking event that excluded men. In this way, the government has made clear that jobs and institutions that have long been dominated mostly by white men will remain so and will be protected with the full weight of the government. The very definition of racial justice has been turned on its face to create layers of protection for those with the most power, privilege, and access. White nativism, not pluralism, has become the brand of our country. Worse yet, because of the potential threat of either litigation or loss of funding, countless colleges, corporations, and other entities have voluntarily pulled their various programs designed to close long, persistent gaps. Their goal is to get us to submit through exhaustion and attrition, to convince us that the persistent racial gaps are the fault of individuals and not the design of institutions. That we have overnight become a beacon of racial equity and progress so substantial that the blood, sweat, and tears of our elders etched into the fabric of our country has served its purpose. But we know that that is not true. A new study from Brandeis University says that the Black-white racial wealth gap has tripled since the 1980s. Unsurprisingly, 30% of this gap is attributable to home ownership with residential segregation playing a key role. About 20% is attributable to disparities in family income and likely much to the disappointment of many. While marriage was found to boost wealth earnings by $75,000 for white families, there's no statistically significant impact on Black families' wealth due to marriage. That is to say that Black folks cannot marry their way out of the reach of systemic racism. We know that Black folks make up 13% of the population, with over 40% of the population of people experiencing homelessness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, all this comes after the failed promises that followed the largest protest in history, prompted by the death of George Floyd. The racial reckoning that wasn't, where for a period of time there was at least a feigning of a recognition of the racialized harms, current and past, and a desire to do something to rectify them. It was in this period of time that California established the Reparations Task Force. By show of hands, how many folks here have either read the report in full or at least some of its recommendations? If you have not, you should absolutely do so. If you can, print it out and read it like a book. It is truly an impressive catalog in history. If you don't have the time or interest in reading the entire thing, you should definitely read through the recommendations. 12 of the first 13 chapters detail harms: enslavement, racial terror, political disenfranchisement, housing segregation, separate and unequal education, racism in environment and infrastructure, pathologizing the African American family, control of creative, cultural, and intellectual life, stolen labor and hindered opportunity, an unjust legal system, mental and physical harm and neglect, and the wealth gap. It's truly a remarkable document, and I was honored to have been able to testify twice before the task force. Once as an expert witness on the criminalization of poverty and homelessness, as well as a witness in support of establishing the California Freedom Affairs Bureau. The document is incredible in that it not only details with laser focus the harms, but in that it also provides a blueprint for how to quantify those harms monetarily. Ironically, the document may be more important now than it was when it was written, given that we find ourselves living in a social political moment in which facts don't matter and data has become optional. After spending years being told that our lived experiences weren't enough and that we needed metrics to back up what we had seen and experienced with our own eyes and bodies. For purposes of our discussion today, I want to hone in on Chapter 11 and its description of the convict leasing system and re-enslavement. Quote, "It is a system known as convict leasing. Laws in the United States Constitution allow private entities to force formerly enslaved people and descendants of enslaved people into doing the same work on the same land and even for the same people as African Americans who would have done when they were enslaved. African American men and boys were arrested on vagrancy charges or minor violations, fined and forced to pay their fine through convict leasing. The convict leasing system was legal because the 13th Amendment allowed forced labor for people who had been convicted of crime. Therefore, the legal system considered incarcerated people to have few rights because, in the words of the Supreme Court of Virginia, they were slaves of the state. The conditions under which incarcerated people worked in the convict leasing system were oppressive. Unlike in the slave era, BCs had no incentives to keep incarcerated people healthy or alive, so the convict leasing system was worse than slavery. Working and living conditions for incarcerated people were dangerous, unhealthy, and violent. Historical documents show that incarcerated individuals at one plantation frequently died from heat stroke, malnourishment, extreme physical activity for extended periods of time, and disease. What does that sound like?
Still happening today.
When drawing a parallel to modern day practice in California, the report states, while individuals serve their prison sentences, the state of California uses their labor in many ways. The California Prison Industry Authority produces myriad products such as clothing, furniture, cleaning products, and food. They also perform a wide range of duties in areas such as laundry, kitchen, and general maintenance. The California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection employed around 1,600 incarcerated individuals to fight forest fires in May 2021. While we know that in theory things like the black codes and other laws put in place to ensure a steady supply of incarcerated folks are available for exploitation were abolished, we also know that over-policing and surveilling has not ended, it persists. Who in this room is aware of the Racial Identity and Profiling Act, also known as RIPA?
What is it?
The Racial Identity Profiling Act, known as RIPA, was a piece of legislation passed in California whereby when a police officer stops someone, they have to notate what they believe the race and ethnicity of the person to be. This is all self-reported data from agencies that volunteer, so it's not compulsory. All the police agencies in California do not participate. Just a couple quick highlights from the latest report before I get back to the Reparations Task Force report. Not news, but individuals perceived as black were stopped 127.87% more than often expected based upon their population of the state. Officers also reported taking more actions during stops of individuals perceived as unhoused compared to other demographic groups, and reported more uses of force against individuals perceived as unhoused. Additionally, officers reported that nearly half of the stops of individuals perceived as unhoused ended in arrest, approximately 50% of the time. Meaning individuals perceived as unhoused were arrested more than any other demographic group. Now, recall earlier I said that black folks make up the vast majority of people who are experiencing houselessness. That is both true in California and nationwide. Mm-hmm. Out of all complaints alleging racial bias, only 3 out of roughly 1,500 were sustained. So despite the numbers pointing to very clear racial bias, virtually no complaint of racial bias was found to have merit. Which is interesting because we're always asked about data that quantifies our experience. Getting back to the Reparations Task Force report, Chapter 17 details the final recommendations of the task force and the periods of time for the specific harms. Those periods of times are health harms, 1850 to present, housing discrimination, 1933 to 1977, or 1850 to present, mass incarceration over policing, 1971 to present, unjust property takings, 1850 to present, and devaluation of African American businesses, 1850 to present. What makes this chapter relevant to our discussion today is that the report quantifies monetary compensation for the harm. Specifically, as it relates to mass incarceration and over-policing, the report states that, quote, though federal and state governments have long targeted African Americans for discriminatory arrest and incarceration, the scope of such unjust policing leapt exponentially when the war on drugs began in 1971. Survey research reveals that people of all races use and sell illegal drugs at remarkably similar rates. To measure racial mass incarceration disparities in the 49 years of the war on drugs from 1971 to 2020, the task force's experts estimate the disproportionate number of years spent behind bars for Black, non-Hispanic drug offenders compared to white, non-Hispanic drug offenders, and multiply those years with what a California state employee would have earned in the average year. In doing so, the experts use the average salary for a California state employee because, as described in Chapter 11, stolen labor, incarcerated individuals were also forced to provide unpaid labor for the state. The experts also added compensation for loss of freedom, comparable to the reparation payments provided to Japanese Americans incarcerated in World War II. Through these methods, the task force experts calculated $159,792 per year in 2020 lost due to the disproportionate mass incarceration and over-policing of African Americans during the war on drugs. Now, I recognize that when we're talking about involuntary servitude and harms of the carceral system, we're not only talking about Black folks. However, it provides a baseline for framing and calculating the harm generally of forced labor and provides one metric for discussing what compensation could be based on: the salary of the state employee. Outside of compensation, the task force report makes the following recommendations: require payment for fair market value for labor provided by incarcerated persons, and amend the California Constitution to end involuntary servitude, and hereby dissolve a remnant of slavery and continue cause of racial inequity. As everyone here is keenly aware, the recent California propositions to amend the Constitution and remove the accept clause that bars involuntary servitude failed, despite now having passed in several other states. Similarly, despite making history in the creation of the Reparations Task Force, most of the reparation bills that have been introduced and made it through the legislative process have not been signed into law. Despite being the big blue state standing up to Trump, we have somehow not found a way to truly stand up for repair and reparations in the ways one would have imagined. In many ways, the lessons taken from our most recent election has been to lean into criminalization, not away from it. Narratives about being soft on crime have resulted in an onslaught of bills introduced this year that add or expand sentencing or monetary punishments. Not only has the racial reckoning not manifested, but has been hamstrung both by the re-election of 47, but also by the unwillingness of those who proclaim to be his foes and the allies of marginalized people who want to do the right thing. So where does this all leave us? I'm admittedly guilty of being often cynical. I don't typically subscribe to changing hearts and minds or that philosophical wing of the struggle. I admit that for me, this is a hard time to be hopeful. However, as I reflect on the fact that our country will soon be celebrating its 250th year anniversary, I'm soothed by the fact that in the entire history of this country, not a year has passed in which oppressed and marginalized people have not been fighting and organizing to truly make it a more perfect place.
That part.
I have hope because that is our legacy and heritage. So as those celebrations commence in the next several months, let's never forget that.
That's right.